Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare Conversations About Horror. My name is Katherine, and I'm delighted, as always, to be joined by Anthony Tresca.
Well, hey there!
This is a podcast where the horrifically nerdy meets the terrifyingly academic, as we explore that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so thankful to have you join us today for our episode over 1989's A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Dream Child.
I'm really excited that we are working our way through the Nightmare franchise. I think that was your idea.
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about the Nightmare on Elm Street films and give myself a reason to finally watch some of the films that I hadn't seen before, like this one. I had not
like seen. This one.
I had not yet managed to make myself watch this one yet, and I can't say that anymore. Now we've watched it.
Yeah, so it feels like for the last, 3 and 4 in particular, I was like, I don't know if I've seen these. And then, we would get together and be like, I had indeed seen it. This one I had not seen. So that one I can actually say I didn't see it, and I was correct. I hadn't seen it before. And I look forward to, at the end of the franchise, for watching all the films at the end of the franchise, I look forward to our spooky scraps where we rank them. Because I'm pretty sure that this one's going to be near, if not at, the bottom for me. And you said something really insightful right before we started recording that, it may not be the best nightmare, but it's still better than a lot of horror.
Yeah, I mean, even A Nightmare on Elm Street film I would still take it over a lot of the, really just generic and kind of boring horror is so much of what gets made today. At least it's interesting to look at, and every single kill is going to look visually interesting, which you can't always say with more modern horror films.
We've talked before about this idea that one of the problems of a lot of modern horror and a lot of horror that comes out of Blumhouse that isn't the big hits is this sort of paint by numbers approach, right? Where it's okay, well, we need to have, and then they just kind of tick stuff off. And even as they've become more, woke, if you will, with Freaky, where they still had this, but it was a creepier version, right? Where they're well, we need to have the sassy gay friend who's going to live at the end, but who gets, and so they're still doing a real paint by numbers sort of feel. And one thing you can say about the Freddy franchise is there's no paint by number, right? In part because, as most people probably know about, particularly Dream Child, people didn't even know what was happening when they were making the film.
It was so
unpaint by numbers, right? Because the script was being written while they were filming and in production. In fact, one of the actors said that he didn't even bother to learn his lines really ahead of time because he just assumed they were going to change on any given day of filming. And you can definitely feel that, I think, for worse in Dream Child, but also at the very least it means that they're not, again, doing that sort of paint by numbers feel. And the deaths in particular, I think someone was like, but what if we went even crazier? And I think that's one of the most endearing aspects of this franchise.
There are still, despite, as we will talk about, the story being just nonsensical and affirmative gobbledygook, the kills in here are still, they're following the trend of the better Nightmare films in that they're all kills that are specifically linked to the characters and their fears and their problems with their families. So that, in the very least, it always makes for entertaining and sometimes thought-provoking deaths, which is always a delight.
No, I that was one thing I was very excited about in this film, because I do think that's what makes the deaths and the dream sequences more terrifying, right, is when they're not generic, but when they're things like, the issue of the food, and the eating disorder and the, parental just pressure. And then that sort of, where she's being fed like a baby. So then there's this like infantization of that character, right? That's a very terrifying death, even though it's not one of their more elaborate. It doesn't take nearly as much time as some death scenes.
That was probably my favorite one, I think. Just because it was so thoroughly chilling, I think.
Yes.
That was the one where I think they used... Freddy doesn't have a ton of lines in that sequence. I think he only says like 2 or 3 things, but it's everything else that's going on that makes that sequence so terrifying. From just the parents in there, again, they're continuing the trend in Nightmare 5 that parents are bad. And they certainly are in this movie, and in that scene in particular. They're snotty, aristocratic party guests who are mocking Greta relentlessly.
Yeah, the cinematography in that sequence is really good, because they use the cameras to create this really alienating effect. Mm-hmm. It's not a very big space, but it feels like that table kind of goes on forever. It feels like the quote adults in the room, right, are like peering down on us.
Yeah.
And it feels uncanny. It feels grotesque, and that's before Greta starts being force fed like a baby, right?
Yeah.
And so it almost doesn't work in that I'm not sure it quite makes sense in terms of like, did she fall asleep at the table? Like there's a couple of things that don't necessarily make logical sense in that sequence, but the impact of that particular death outweighs the rest of my concerns about it.
Yeah, and the turning of Greta into that porcelain doll that she was carrying with her when she was mourning over Dan. In this scene, and then the callback with Greta in a later scene where Freddy just pushes her off when he's torturing Mark. Also, just a good callback, and I don't know, very chilling.
It is, because as you said, this film continues a motif that we've seen through all the films, and that is that parents range from uninterested to downright terrible.
Yeah.
And through this one character of Greta, we kind of get to see a whole range of things, right? We get to see like what happens when you treat children like children when they're not really children anymore, when they're dealing with these big issues. Mm-hmm. You get to see, this idea of parents who craft their children as toys or dolls, right, for their mm-hmm. own amusement. You get to see what happens when you have that sort of like children are to be seen but not heard mentality. I mean, there's a lot that manages to pack into this one character who dies early enough that she's not very developed, but she's still incredibly developed.
Oh, yeah. I think you know everything you need to know about Greta from just even that one sequence.
Exactly.
Which is, I think that means that they did a good job there in capturing that moment and choosing that death. And there are some other really good deaths in this one, too. I think that the Mark comic book death.
I love that death.
Yeah, it's that weird pseudo comic booky aesthetic where Freddy's like slashing all the pipes. It's in black and white, and then Mark goes full superhero for a moment. And of course, as we get Super Freddy, which even though I hadn't seen Nightmare 5 before, I did know about Super Freddy because I guess that's just one of the weird things that made it into the cultural zeitgeist about the Nightmare things, is when he goes, I'm Super Freddy or whatever, and then so that was fun, and then turns Mark into a paper cartoon person and kills Freddy, who Freddy kills, sorry.
I think what I like, well, there's several things I like about that death scene. I like the fact that it has some really interesting special effects going on. That, like you said, it kind of has this fun play with a type of Freddy we haven't seen before. I think it also is really interesting because I think that this sequence actually does a better job of showing the sort of conflict between daydreaming and nightmares than even actually Nightmare 4 did.
The fourth one, yeah.
Mm-hmm. In fact, I would have been, happy to kind of see that be the premise of 4. And we've seen this before, actually, in Dream Warriors as well, when the kid in the wheelchair, becomes like the D&D master, right? And the wizard.
The wizard.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there's something really interesting about these characters that are, even within this these group of teens that are sort of disenfranchised, the one that's kind of like on the lower end of the totem pole, get to see how their daydreams protect them, right? Ultimately, of course, not enough, but I think there's something really interesting there.
It's a fun little element of like monkey paw too, where it's like wish fulfillment. It's a good sequence. I kind of wish this is one element that I have not ever said about a sequence before, but I kind of wish it had gone maybe a little bit more. I wish that it had maybe committed to a full cartoon aesthetic for at least a more significant portion of it. I think it would have been really interesting to see like a cartoon Freddy just doing the cartoon violence and like killing them in that sequence. We get it for a brief moment at the end, but I was kind of just waiting for the whole thing to transition into this real cartoon land rather than this like pseudo real world but comic book aesthetic planted on top of it, because I think it would have been more interesting to completely have Freddy submerge Mark in this upside down cartoon world and be like, do you really like this? This is the logic that's at play here. It doesn't make any sense. I can do whatever I want to you, and I can keep killing you every issue, page after page. I think that would have been really interesting.
Yeah, there was something about the character of Mark in general, and I think it was his like ability to claim some agency, but then to see that defeated, that I felt similarly, as though I wasn't given quite as much as I wanted. And I know that, you have to like start killing people off at a pretty decent pace if you're gonna, make it through to the end. But I think you're absolutely correct that would have been really interesting, in part, or perhaps especially, because this is Dream Child, right?
Yeah.
So we are thinking about what it means, to like have a child in this world, and children's cartoons are some of the most violent things you can watch, right? So I think that would have been really interesting, and I'm sure that if they would have, had a script ahead of time, that would have been something that probably would have occurred to them, because that would have been such a perfect inclusion. That's really a pity.
It really would have been, and I think it would have been it would have perhaps introduced the idea for later films, although I don't know, maybe they do this. I have not seen any of the Nightmare films past this point, so maybe they do this in a later film, and if they do, I'll retcon this and I'll mention that they did do this in a later episode. But
yeah,
Freddy being able to jump between mediums, I think, is something that they don't fully utilize as well as they could, which is the fact that he could create any environment in any location and put you in any situation. And that includes, in this case, it would have, I think, been interesting, the cartoon world, or like total dreamland, where like there is no clear rules like are present on Earth, Earth rules or whatnot, which I think they don't use that quite enough as they maybe could have.
I agree. And I would really be excited. I know that they don't do this. I would be excited to see a film that was just sort of Freddy through genre, right? So it's just like they're moving through different genres of films, and so you get to see like what's fundamentally nightmarish about something even as gentle as like the rom-com, right? Like, yeah, I just think that'd be really interesting. I think there would have been space for this if they had cut out or if they'd condensed some of what I think was the longest death sequence, or at least it felt the longest, and that was Dan's. So they even give credit to it in the film itself, in the credits, but the sort of Machine Man esque elements they admit are inspired by Geiger's artwork, and you may be familiar with Geiger's artwork because he's he helped inspire the terrifying image that is the Alien in the Alien franchise.
Of course.
And so it's disturbing. It's beautiful. It's another example of some lovely practical effects. But I think of the deaths, we've just praised Greta and Mark's for fitting the character. Dan's doesn't quite fit his character, or at least not as I understand his character.
I don't really understand why that death is here. They kind of do something. It's just a really grab bag thing, because it's like it's horrifying about falling asleep at the wheel, which is not specific to Dan as a character. It's horrifying because it's about drinking and driving, which is not specific to Dan. Also, not what he did. I guess it's horrifying because Freddy has the radio have Dan's parents say some bad things about him to distract it, which is, I guess, the most character-specific thing that happens. But other than that, then the motorcycle, he turns into the motorcycle, which we're not led to believe Dan has been in really a big motorcycle person in any way, or is really addicted to technology, and that's why he has to become technologically all over himself like that. It's just kind of like a cool sequence, but not so much a very impactful one, because you're just like, oh, I guess those things are technically scary, but like, not for this character specifically any more than it would be for Joe Bob or somebody.
So I think, it's clear so far that the things that we appreciate are the things we appreciate about all the Nightmare films, and that is that the death sequences are interesting, they're intriguing, they're doing things that are playing with form and content in some fun ways. To me, though, that is more or less where the things that I like about this film end.
Yeah, that's about it, because yet again, this is the second Nightmare film now that is a direct continuation of the previous film. We're following Alice from the fourth Nightmare, and this is also the second Nightmare film that is affirmative horror, and both of those elements combine together, as well as some nonsensical choices they make story-wise in how they develop the child aspect of this main story plot, just leads to this film, I think, being way more boring, and just kind of, I found it kind of hard to sit through. Because anytime Alice was on screen, I was just like, this scene is not going to be very interesting, unfortunately.
Yeah, so let's break this down. Let's start with the continuation, element.
But let's start there.
Because a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times when you have a film that is going to pick up and is going to bring back the same actors and the same characters, that's a win, right? Because a lot of times you can't guarantee that you're going to get them, and so then you have these sequels that you're like, how is this in the franchise, right? So oftentimes it's a win to have that continuation. However, in the Nightmare series, it's a real deficit.
Yeah.
And I think it's a real deficit in part because the whole thing that makes the Nightmare franchise work is the sort of serial nature of things, but also the sort of the fact that it is episodic in the same way that dreams are often episodic, right?
It's a big thing that I think it allows it to be kind of more universal too. It's like everybody dreams, so why should we limit ourselves to the same small pool of people if everyone dreams, and in theory this could happen to everyone, which is something that I think works so beautifully about the first three Nightmare films. Is you get a very large range of people who dream and the various ways in which they dream, and why their particular version of that dream is so disturbing. But then in the fourth and fifth Nightmare, thus far, they're just doubling down on, it's only this small group of people who Freddy's really affecting and like traumatizing, which lowers the stakes quite a bit than if it is like Freddy can go anywhere and torment anyone. Because you're just like, well, maybe he can do that, but for whatever reason, Freddy's got this weird fixation on this group of friends in this town here, and they're the only ones who his weird dreaming things really apply to.
Right, and it's not even as direct or as explicit of a connection as with Nancy, right? Where at least he's like, okay, well, he's terrorizing the children of the people who directly, caused his death. It's like, well, these are just, like you said, the people he's fixated on. And I think the problem is that this is a franchise that says cause and effect doesn't have any bearing in this world, right? Causality is not something that should concern you because it's not going to make sense. Oh, except for the ways in which you're supposed to see this cause and effect relationship, right? Of continuing Alice's story. And I think one of the things that, and this is so silly for it to drive me this crazy, but one of the things that really drives me mad, is how long it takes Greta, Yvonne, and Mark to believe Alice, because all she has to do is say, remember how like 5 of our friends mysteriously died last year?
Yep.
Remember that? And they're like, oh yeah. And she's like, do you want to know why? Right? Like, there's this really weird way in which the film is asking us to remember the previous film, but the characters aren't remembering the previous film.
Right? Yeah, like, that's a great point. That is an absolutely fantastic point, because I kept waiting for Alice to drop her trump card, because I mean that is what that would be. It would be like, yeah, I can really easily explain this because this has happened before. And this has happened before. This is a thing that, like, is common, kind of seemed like common knowledge. But then all of a sudden, they were just like, no, we have, in the Nightmare films, all of our leading heroines haven't been believed, so we have to continue this. Rather than try a new formula where Alice, if we are establishing, as they had done in the previous film, that Alice is pretty competent, and people they were trustworthy, and people seem to believe her. But in this film, for no reason other than to have this element of disbelief and people teaming up against Alice, did it make sense? Now I get why the adults would team up against Alice.
Sure.
That makes total sense, and particularly why Dan's parents would be like, I'm trying to paint you as a crazy person so we can have your baby. Sure, all that makes sense. But why, filmmakers? Why would you not have her friends who believe her? It just doesn't. Yeah. It's an asinine choice.
I think you hit the nail on the head in that part of the problem is we've seen this before, right? So it is interesting, I think, the first film in a franchise to have someone say, like, I don't know, that seems a little wackadoo. But you're absolutely correct. We are now in film 5, and that's been the premise of to varying degrees of the previous 4 films. At this point, we know it's true, right? Like, I think even in Nightmare on Elm Street, the 84 film, we could be like, well, maybe she's making this all up. It could turn out to be this, like, weird other thing, right?
Yeah.
But we know by now Freddy's real. This is going to happen. And it seems so silly. And it also seems silly that, like, in this timeline, her other friends could not have died all that long ago. No. Right? Because she's still in high school. And, like, how'd she make new friends so quickly? Where were these friends when the previous film happened? How come they didn't, like, at the graduation say, in memory of the people who randomly weirdly died? I just feel like if you're going to say that the past affects the future by continuing the film, you have to carry it through. Mm-hmm. And I felt like even Dan was like, I don't know, Alice, that seems pretty far-fetched. And it's like, are you kidding me? Were you not there for the previous film? Do you not remember it? It just felt like there was a weird amnesia that we even as the audience were supposed to adopt. But why would we?
Yeah, I felt like the filmmakers were gaslighting us, because they were like, they both wanted us to remember the previous events of the film, but also so that they didn't have to work too hard to come up with a new story. They were like, we are not going to remember it, and we don't hold ourselves. We're going to treat this as if this is all new for the first time. Even though they repeat so many different elements from previous films, yet this is another film in which Freddy has a rebirthing scene There's another rebirthing scene in this film where this time from little baby to monstrous self. Although I did want to talk briefly about this rebirthing scene because it happens in a church and it seems to confirm your reading of Freddy as a Christ figure from a few movies back when you did this, because Freddy comes up and he aligns with the cross in the stained glass window during that rebirth scene. And in a film that doesn't have a lot of really good moments to grab onto, I remembered your reading of Freddy as a Christ figure from a few films back, and I was like, I am so happy they included this, because this means you're right! You're right!
No, I had the same thoughts, that they really painted this version of Amanda, even more so than the previous ones, as the sort of, like, Mother Mary figure, right? Who doesn't have the virginal aspect, but has the Madonna role, right?
Mm-hmm.
Of she's so pure that even having been corrupted by the world, she's still, So I want to talk more about the child scene too, because I don't think it really bothers me, and this is going to lead us to our discussion about the affirmative a little bit more. It really bothers me, this idea that Freddy is born literally monstrous, right? And this continuation of his backstory, where he's like the product of, this gang rape, which had this really weird sequence of like, of us seeing the like, prison, which really looked more like a cave, and everyone was like, or the asylum, and like everyone was like milling about, and like, Amanda's like, hello, I'm down here, and they're like, well, let's be done for the day, right? Like, it could have been a really fascinating scene, because it could have continued the franchise's commentary on various institutions, right? And so it could have been a really interesting look at how we treat people who are mentally ill as animals, right? Like, it could have been, but instead it was like, but aren't they? Because they raped her the moment they could. And then Freddy is born into this creepy little monstrous thing that already looks, deformed and scarred, instead of us understanding that, like, he looks burned because a bunch of parents burned him alive. And so we lose, I think, sort of that element of, did we make Freddy, or did Freddy make us? That 84 is so good about doing with that ambivalence. Instead, it's like, Freddy was always a monster. He was a monster from the time he was conceived, despite the love of his Madonna mother. And he was born that way, and he was always going to be that way. And that to me is just not interesting.
You're absolutely right. This film is in line with this affirmative nature that it has. And it's very supportive of the status quo and the way the world normally works. And it is, because of that, I think, incredibly simplistic and dualistic, in that things can only be pure good or pure evil, and that makes their source of horror in this film, which is arguably children and parents, as it has been for the last several Nightmare films now. Even though I said 2 films back, I did not think that there was any reason to revisit this source of horror, because they had perfectly developed it in an incredibly interesting way over 3 films, seeing this idea in 3 very different contexts, and then they really satisfyingly concluded it in the 3rd film, I thought. But then they trotted it back out again in the 4th film, to diminishing returns, and except in the 4th film, at least it wasn't so clear-cut. It wasn't as clearly tied to dualism of, like, all good or all evil things. But now in this film, they were just like, well, I guess we'll do it again, and this time we'll play for the people in the way back, and we'll just simplify it so much so that people can just turn their brains off and understand what's going on. Freddy evil, Alice good, children are either pure good or pure evil, and you never know until you have the child.
Right. And mother figures are either Madonnas, or not so much a horror in this case as is the usual dichotomy, but monsters, right? You either have Amanda and Alice, or you have Greta's mom. Those are your options.
Dan's
and you know
parents,
what I think? I think what upsets me the most, so those of you that are normal listeners, you might be wondering, or you might not, where the scholarship is. And the truth is that it was really hard to find scholarship because there's not much, if anything, really has been written on 5.
Shocking.
Shocking, I know. But the article I want to reference is by a gentleman named Gary Heba, is how I've chosen to pronounce his last name. The article is called Everyday Nightmares, the Rhetoric of Social Horror in the Nightmare on Elm Street series. And in talking about 5, he says that Dream Child makes another transition in the coding of members of the dominant culture by showing sympathetic parents. Mm-hmm. And so he talks about the role of Alice's father, who's very sympathetic,
yes.
shockingly so, right? He's like, he just says, like, let's not do this again, but let's raise this child in love. But he's also crafted, Heba points out, as this other figure because he's an alcoholic. He's lower socioeconomic class.
Yep.
And, he's kind of, even though Alice wants him to be at her graduation, she's also kind of embarrassed both when he's not there, but also when he shows up. And so we have instances like that, Alice's father, and also, I think, to some degree, Jacob,
yes,
that create this potential for us to have this really fascinating ambiguity, right?
Something outside the binary of good and evil.
Exactly, because Jacob, I think is as close as we get, because he has to make that decision. Is he gonna, listen to his mother, Alice, or is he gonna listen to his, like, pseudo-father, possibly real father, Freddie? But I love that analogy of, like, they're playing for the people that are way in the back, and they're like, we got to make sure that they can see it, so let's just make it black and white.
Yeah.
And we'll keep it simple. And that's so disappointing for a franchise that, at least for the first 3 films, said, isn't it interesting how everything's in shades of gray?
Yeah, this film absolutely leaves no room for a gray area in here. For a majority of the characters, any gray area seems purely accidental, like with the father and with Jacob to some extent, because they don't really commit to either of those ideas. Particularly not the father, because about halfway through the film, they just kind of, like, commit to him being really loving and just always there for her. So he's like, oh, I guess he's fine now, though. This is fine. Let's just move on.
Yeah, and there's no real, like, they could have made it so that we see that, like, the sympathetic father figure is ostracized by the other parents, either because he's, like, assuming this maternal role. Like, there could have been some really interesting things to happen.
I thought it would have been super interesting to see him be, like, kind of ostracized, because he does take on a lot of these feminine tasks in the film he is shown to be doing and putting himself in this role and being comfortable and okay with that, which is super interesting and something I thought that they were going to explore, particularly if we're going to trot out this theme of parents and child again, that it would be interesting to see what happens when you have one parent having to play the role of 2 and having to take up different characteristics of both parents that are there.
Yeah, because Alice is going to have to do the same thing.
Yes.
Right? At the very end of the film, we get this interesting moment where it's her, Yvonne, and I forget, is the dad there?
At the very end of the film?
Yeah. So yeah, it's her.
Yes.
It's the
it is.
It's the grandfather or Alice's father and Yvonne, and so there's this really interesting moment where they're like this new nuclear family.
It's a new found family.
It's a found family. It's a family where the male, patriarchal element is really kind of lacking, because Dan was sort of an uber bro, despite the fact he was a good guy, so there's so many interesting things that this film could have done if it had just taken, like, 2 steps more forward. Even the premise of the idea that, like, babies are sort of perpetually asleep in the womb, and so if a baby is always dreaming, then wouldn't that mean that Freddie would always have access to someone, right? That's a clever concept in its, like, nugget form.
Yeah.
But it needed to go 2 steps forward.
Because I think at its present stage, it just kind of felt like weirdly pro-life in a weird way, where it was just kind of like, baby begin here and the dream happen here. Why? Because we need to make our plot work.
Yeah, it was. I don't think it was, like, even subtly, right? It's
no.
It's a very pro-life film in that respect. whether or not they meant it to, I think you're right, is independent from what happened.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of like what this film does, right? Like, so some of the other films, we've talked about the fact that one of the interesting things that happens, even as early as the first film, is this critique of institutions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in the first film, it's the institution of like the police force / patriarchy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, in the second, the school is a big element that's being sort of analyzed. In the third, it's the institution itself, the literal institution. And then in the fourth one, it's a little bit the school, although it's a lot not, right? Because the fourth one's beginning to shift things. But this film had so much, again, we're at the first film in the franchise where the characters are graduating high school and are being expected to sort of live in the world that has been crafted for them by the prior generations. And there's hints of it, right? Like Greta doesn't really want to be a model and Dan doesn't really want to play football. But like it would have been, but that's not enough, right?
There are so many interesting things that could have been done with this idea of being forced to enter into the workforce / into polite society in Greta's case that could have been quite an interesting critique of what happens when the children are forced to take on the legacy of and the world that their parents have shaped for them. That has the potential to lead to a really interesting critique and analyses of this system that we currently create and how it kind of is backwards, that the people who come before us are the ones who predominantly shape the world that we live in, and a majority of children's lives is just undoing the things that the generations before them had to do. Now, obviously, all of that is just what we read into the film and like an idea that we had based on a couple of lines and scenes in this film, because that's not what this film is about. It's the first Nightmare film that I don't even really think attempts an institutional critique of any of the larger systems at be, which is just a real missed opportunity.
It is. It would be really fascinating. I think I would really enjoy seeing a new film in the franchise that does exactly that, right? It's them after they've graduated high school, or maybe after they've graduated college now, and they're entering into this workforce that feels like a nightmare, because it is, right? Like it's 9 to 5 and it's gray and monotone, and then like suddenly, and then that slowly shifts into, at first, this like daydream and everything feels lovely, and then they realize, but it's actually Freddy playing with them, and like I think that would just be so fascinating, but that's not what's really happening here, right? Instead, it's they were trying to think, what could we do next, and then I think somebody probably stumbled upon in some reading, like in a newspaper, some tidbit that said like, hypothesis, babies dream in the womb, and they were like, yes, there's the idea. And they were like, who cares what else will happen? That's what the story is about. I think that must be like the origin story of this particular film, because it's the only thing that explains its lack of development in a franchise that every other film, to weaker extent, but like has had this really like pointed message about the institutions that craft meaning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It really doesn't even really do anything with this idea that we've seen throughout the franchise of, it's the weakest one in terms of what dreams actually mean and are supposed to represent and have anything. It doesn't really have anything to say about dreams anymore. It really is just like, it's back to that, how dualistic this film is. It's like dreams are either good or they're a nightmare. There's no gray area anymore, where we kind of get to see the gray area of the dreams. Like sometimes things are scary, but then it's able to be okay because you're able to come out of it, or it's not okay, but it's like better than just all terrible and all bad. Dreams are yet again reduced to this binary. It's put on this binary in a way that the previous Nightmare films have never put dreams in.
I think the best example of that point is the very last dream sequence in the 84 film, right? Where she, exits the house and it's all sunny, and Nancy's mom is like, I'm so glad I quit the drink. And Nancy's like, me too, Mom. And then she sees all of her friends alive, and then we realize that she's still caught in the nightmare, right? And that's one of the most haunting dream sequences in that film, because it starts out with you thinking that it's a good dream, right? And we get to see how quickly a good dream can become a bad dream, and I would like to see more of that, right? I would like to see more of people thinking that they're caught in a good dream before realizing they're in a bad one, because that's really what this franchise is talking about when it comes to suburbia and the nuclear family and, these systems that seem like a good thing on the surface, but then end up being corrupt or broken underneath, right? Like, that's the premise of these earlier films, and I hope that because I also have not seen... I haven't seen 6. I've seen some of the other ones, but I haven't seen 6. I'm hoping that we'll get back there. I don't think we do, based on my knowledge of the other films, so I'm really hoping that only one film will get us there. But that's what this series, I think, deserves.
Yeah, I even still, with all that said, as I said up at the top, despite having so many really just strong, guttural objections to this film, at least at the end of the day, it is more original and more fun than just a paint-by-numbers, really boring, dull horror flick. So you can at least take solace if you do decide to watch this film,
or have seen it,
I am able to recognize that there are some just like if you turn your brain off and don't think about it at all and don't think about this as part of the larger franchise, how you could find some real enjoyment out of it. Because if you just grab onto the individual sequences, the nightmare sequences themselves, they are admittedly a hell of a lot of fun. Even when I'm like, maybe they could have gone further or done this just a little bit better, they're still fun. Robert Englund comes in again and he's really he's camping it up by this point. This is like
exactly. Yeah, he knows who Freddy is, and he knows who he wants Freddy to be. And this is normally pejorative, but there's a sloppiness to the Nightmare franchise that is one of its greatest strengths, right? Yeah. Because they aren't trying to make it fit into this box, and sometimes, it's not even resembling a shape at all. But I think you're right that this film still gives you some entertaining kills. It gives you Robert Englund, which really, right there, is enough. And I'm excited to see where we go next.
Yeah, me too. Dear listeners, don't you worry. We will be returning back to the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. Not our next episode, but the episode after that we'll pick back up with Nightmare 6. Instead, next time we're going to be taking a brief detour to Texas to pick up some chainsaws and view a massacre.
Excellent. And in case that code was too hard for you to crack, our next film is going to be on
Texas Chainsaw Massacre. We're doing the original one back from the 70s.
Excellent. And this is coming to us from a request.
Yes.
From a listener. So the lesson is that if you are a listener, you should let us know what you would like to see us talk about, because we are happy to fit it into our rotation.
Absolutely.
As long as you're okay with the fact that we may not love the film as much as you do, because the first time I watched Texas, I just remember being really grossed out. So I'm excited to see, now that I've seen things that are way more traumatizing. I'm excited to see how I feel about Texas Chainsaw this time. In the meantime, we will have a spooky scrap on Nightmare 5 where we're going to talk a little bit more about children and why it's not just Anthony and I, but the entire horror genre that thinks that they're creepy and gross.
Yep.
And so we hope that you check that out. Anthony, what else do they need to know?
Well, you should definitely take a look at all of our social media pages. We're pretty active on there. That's probably the best way to reach us if you want to leave us a suggestion. If you want to just tell us how good we're doing, obviously our egos would definitely be appreciative of that. And it's just a great way to stay up to date with us. So all of that is linked in the description below. And you know what? other than that, I just want to thank you so much for listening and remind you to have a spooktacular day.